practice doing that. Okay, so expect some of that coming down the pike. I haven't heard back from them about this here projection problem. Can you guys see that from back there as well? Yes, the red lines. I made the joke to my intro class. It was like when I went and saw The Who when I was 16 years old at Memorial Coliseum. It's cool, like laser light show, man. And it looked kind of like that, flickering red lights. Oh, it was green. Okay, we were talking about Thomas Cole. Quite like Thomas Cole. Some of his stuff is a little, as we'll see today, some of the straightforward landscapes are significantly, for my money, are significantly better than the places where he starts to pull direct biblical references or narratives in, right? So in each of these, he does that, but with the Metropolitan Museum work on your right, it's more subtle, right? The idea of the passing flood and God's promise, which we already saw when we looked at Church's Niagara Falls, right? That theme of this is the promised land, right? That we have come through the flood metaphorically and have arrived on dry land, and God's promise is to us this land. And that remains a theme in American landscape painting, is this idea of America as the promised land for the pilgrims who have ventured across the sea, right, escaping England. And Cole sees these pictures as not just personal, like our reading said, but he also sees them as sort of omens for the nation, ways in which he might help warn us of where we're headed. And on Mount Holyoke, he was particularly loved this area and loved its wildness, and that's what he shows us. But in fact, there was already a road to the top and carriages taking people to the top, and he was overrun by tourists, and he didn't like that. Right? He's a quasi environmentalist of sorts. Right? But we'll look at other pictures by him today that do what the one on the left is doing, which is to narrativize. Is that a word? Add narrative to landscape. And for Cole, this is kind of an important issue because when we were talking about the Peale children, right, Rubens and Raphael and whatnot, we had talked about the fact that certain kinds of painting were not as valued as other kinds of painting in the 19th century, right? Remember that Charles Wilson didn't want Rubens to do still life paintings, right? Because it's a lowly genre of paintings. It's not up to the importance of the sorts of things he hoped his kids would do. And landscape was also seen as a very low kind of painting, not particularly challenging nor particularly sophisticated in its meanings. And Cole is on the vanguard of trying to elevate the status of landscape painting to a more acceptable and respected type of art. And this is happening not only in America, but also in England at the same time. And Cole, you remember, is an English expatriate. He had moved to America only in 1818, began really focusing on landscapes in 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal and his show in New York, right? In fact, Trumbull bought one of his pictures at that show, right? And commented on what a natural genius Thomas Cole was, how he never had any schooling, which is not true, but how he could paint sort of naturally the way most of us trained our lives to and still couldn't, is what Trumbull said about Thomas Cole. So this idea with both of these of trying to find the grandeur of God on the right, or even adding narrative details, both of them are attempts to make landscape more important in the market than it was. And this goes hand in hand with what we talked about with the National Academy of Design and the Art Union, right, in the 20s and 30s, is trying to elevate arts to a higher echelon in America. At the end of class, we saw Thomas Cole hunkered down amid the rocks, which is important for him as a Mason. Rocks remain for him incredibly important symbols and metaphors in all of his pictures. Whenever you see a Thomas Cole, you should pay attention to the rocks. And here he's protected by them, this bit that seems as if it's been carved out by God just for him. And this certainly relates to his ideas as a Mason. I love the little set of birds between us and the river, just behind his parasol and painting stool. It adds to the sense of where he is, and that vertiginous drop-off, a dangerous drop-off from the foreground to the background, which is a total Thomas Cole thing, right? He loves putting us up on the edge, on the precipice of danger. Now, the fact that he shows himself painting outside is probably a fabrication. I just read this morning, I was poking through some stuff, that tube paint, the first tube paint, 1841. That's nice to know, right? So the idea of paint in pre-mixed metal tubes, that you could throw a bunch of them in a box and go out and paint in the outdoors, was something that didn't exist prior to 1841. And it doesn't mean that everybody started doing it in 1841, right? As soon as the tubes came out, slowly but surely, we start to see people working outside more frequently. So this is totally an artifice. Like, Cole is not working outside like this, right? He didn't hunker down in the rocks while that lightning storm, and you can even see the lightning behind the tree, that lightning storm blew by, right? He didn't weather the storm up there, right? But that's how he wants us to see him, as the man out in the elements. He would make drawings outside, and they too often have this intense, dangerous drama to them. The Bridge of Fear, right? I don't know if that's what it was actually called, or if Cole in this charcoal drawing is just, or it might be a lead pencil drawing, but it's still trying to bring our attention to the drama of the American landscape. But this is certainly a theme that runs through his and other people's works, is looking at the wonder of the world, in particular the wonder of the New World, as being signs of God's handiwork, right? The wonder of it should lead us to the wonder of God. And this is certainly what Cole is working with, right? So let's see. Moving to another painting, right? Crawford Notch. His work around the Hudson River leads him into various parts of New England. So Mount Holyoke is in Massachusetts. Crawford Notch is in New Hampshire, right? So even though he's Hudson River School, he's not specifically only New York, right? But rather through various states in the Northeast. And this particular site, Crawford Notch, is a site where a recent major tragedy had taken place. There was a landslide here that killed many people. 9 people died, buried alive in a landscape at Crawford Notch. And the story was so famous that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story about it. Actually wrote a poem about Crawford Notch. And people have suggested that perhaps Cole's picture is either inspired by the same thing, quite obviously, but also maybe even based on some of the things that Hawthorne had written about. And I haven't had a chance to compare the two to verify that. Right? Now, what's interesting is that Cole doesn't show us a landslide. We're not actually seeing the tragedy. What we are seeing is that dramatic moment before the tragedy. Right? The seconds before it takes place. And so what we see as we look through is we see a man on a horseback working his way back on a path. We can follow that path as it goes over to that house and then switches back to the right and ends up going through that very, very tight mountain pass, right? And to the base of the mountain behind it. Again, notice on the left-hand side of the pass the importance of those rocks for Cole again, right? And I've got some really nice details in this. So as we work our way back to the house, we see a child with a man in a red waistcoat, puppy dog running with them on the path. It's very cozy. It's almost as if humans are in tune with nature here, nestled in the corner, smoke lazily rising from the cottage from two different chimneys, right? And just sort of quaint and happy. And this is nothing to suggest the coming tragedy, right? This is arguably man in harmony with nature, or maybe in this case, fooling himself into thinking he's in harmony with nature, for anyone who would have known what the title referred to. As we continue past that, we see a stagecoach on the road after it makes the bend by the house and moving its way, chock full of people into the notch. And you can see that Cole has highlighted the top of the rock in Crawford Notch, right? And the way it hangs over to give us this sense of coming drama as the stagecoach moves into the danger zone, if you will, right? Up above, some idea that something bad's going to happen. There's a storm gathering, right? That is certainly just like it is in horror movies, right? When you hear thunder, you know bad stuff's about to happen. And we see the rain beginning to cascade down. And of course, this is what will lead to the landslide that will then kill the people. Again, Cole loves putting rocks on top of rocks, right? Placing them there as if God himself has been out there balancing things around. And that appears in almost every one of his pictures. With the idea that something bad is about to happen, I think this is kind of fascinating. The foreground detail. We have this shed, 3 cows in front of it, one kneeling. But one of them is wagging his tail and is sort of perked up its ears and is looking off toward the notch. And the man's horse looks jittery, as if it's holding back. And I think with both of these, there's this idea that the animals know. The animals are sensing that something is coming, more so than the people themselves are, right? And that adds to this overall sense of drama. So again, this is a well-known theme to anybody in the 1840s who would have seen it, is the tragedy at Crawford Notch. And Cole's work sort of ramps up the drama, not by showing us the actual tragedy, but by showing us the peaceful moment before. And giving us a lot of signs that something's about to happen. I think it's kind of fascinating that this scene is a man-made field. If you look at the place where the path moves through, you can see that this used to be forest, and that it is covered by cut down limbs everywhere we see. Man has removed the trees. And indeed, our view of the scene, based on this huge stump in the foreground, is only afforded by the fact that we have clear-cut this. Man has come in and created a field out of a forest, right? That's the only reason we can see the notch and the house in the background and the shed and the cows and the stagecoach, is because it's been clear-cut throughout. And this relates, I think, in much to what Cole is thinking about with landscape, which is that our manipulation of landscape is ruining it. It's a sign of our lack of harmony with the world. And that perhaps, as an underlying theme, the tragedy at Crawford Notch is nature getting back at us for actually being out of harmony with our environment. despite what might seem at first glance to be exactly the opposite with that cute little cottage. But as you look across the front of the canvas, you'll notice that on either side of our chopped down trees, we have trees that nature has destroyed. Right? We have stumps on the left and stumps on the right, naturally framing the scene. But the view through is a view that's given by mankind's destruction of that landscape. So I think Cole is setting up across the foreground this dichotomy between nature doing things in its way, mankind doing things in his way, which is not natural. And in Cole's view, what we know from his writings is that he looked down on this. He did not approve. Now, with this idea of trying to narrativize landscape, right? Crawford Notch does this as well. Makes a connection between landscape and history, right? His Waning of the Waters of the Deluge made a connection between landscape and biblical painting. Here we go. Landscape and history painting as well. From Cole. This was a commission he received to paint a pair of landscape pictures, and the commission, all it said was that the man who wanted it wanted a picture of the morning and a picture of the evening as a pair, right? And Cole uses that commission, uses that opportunity to do something more special with it, to create a narrative across the two panels that underscores the idea of morning and evening through storytelling, right? So the departure is the morning scene. Okay? Now we're down on the flats, but we still have this amazingly dramatic landscape in the background with the birds floating up over the tops of those rocks, waterfalls cascading down behind the castle, the tops of the peaks nestled in clouds. As you can see, he does a Crawford Notch as well. And to underscore the idea of daybreak, morning, he shows us a series of medieval knights embarking on some sort of escapade, probably a crusade or at least a battle of some sort, because they are armed, right, and on horseback, and moving their way from the castle in the background across this bridge through the gate, coming now to a fork in the road and making this turn toward the center of the picture. But you can see behind the crossroads marker that road continues off to the left. So they've reached a fork in the road. And he wants you to read the picture this way, right? He wants you to look at it and work your way through it mentally as we move our way through the landscape. So here's some good details of this one as well. So there we see the drawbridge being raised back up now that people have left. We imagine our route working our way around down the hill, coming through the gate and across the bridge as our energetic horses and crusaders are off to their mission, which he doesn't really spell out exactly what it is. As we follow the path around, and again painted in exquisite detail, right? We see the figures come around, and on a white horse at the front of the entourage is certainly its leader. The white horse signals that. Man on a mission of religious purity, if you will. Right? And they've made this turn, right? And they're working their way toward the center of the panel. And what happens there is they meet this hermit. Looks like a pilgrim, actually, standing on the path. And what's he doing? Right? Hold up. Wait a second. Right? He's telling them to listen, hold up and talk. I have something to tell you, right? So the gesture says stop, and the horse is stopping. And why is he stopping them? And this comes through close looking. Look at the path. Look at the road they're on. Look at the rocks, right? Look at the other path that they had been on that continues off canvas. It's smooth and cleared. They are taking the rocky path, right? Now, I don't think I really have to explain that to you too much, right? The rocky path is indeed the dangerous route. At the same time, it gives Cole his opportunity to paint rocks, which he loves. And so our hermit is warning them. This is not the right direction. If you follow the rocky path, you shouldn't expect good things to happen. Right? You expect to stumble and fall. And it's left open at this point what's going to happen. Right? But we have, again, like Crawford's Notch, this portentous warning that bad things are coming if you follow down this path. Now, it's fascinating for Thomas Cole, and Anastasia, this is true for your picture as well, is that these narrative pictures about people moving through landscape as a metaphor for life's activities. Cole also sees these as metaphors for the country. That the future could go any direction, and choosing the right path for the future is, in fact, crucial. That if you go down the wrong path, the nation could suffer. And in the 1830s, we are at the beginning of the great push west. Manifest Destiny, the Monroe Doctrine. The idea that America is destined to populate this land from shore to shore. So our departure can be seen as a metaphor for the embarkation on that path. And Cole, in many pictures, uses these narratives to underscore the fact that progress of empire, the ways in which major world powers expand, leads only to one thing, which is fall and destruction. Be it ancient Rome, right? The Holy Roman Empire, ancient Persia. All of these came up in literature at the time as examples of people who got headstrong in expanding empire. Right? And for Cole, these have that as an undercurrent as well. That the path, our path through nature is this path through life, right? Walking through nature, and we find this in poetry and in the history of landscape pictures, the idea that when you walk through the land, you have a microcosm of what life is all about, right? There are hills, there are valleys. The Bible talks about a high road and a low road, right? The high road is more difficult, the low road is easy. Everybody wants to take the low road, but the high road is the way you should try, And that metaphor of our journey through the landscape as being our journey through life is strong in the minds of painters ever since we have landscape painting, all the way back to the 16th century. And for Cole, that's there, but he then layers on that. The idea of the nation is a pilgrim as well. The nation is a wanderer through a landscape. Right? So we should see this on two different levels. Okay, they're being warned. Don't go this way This is the rocky path, right? This is dangerous, right? It's fraught with enemies. The smooth path is the right way to go. As a bit of a clue, what we have down that path are the ruins of previous civilizations. This bit of architecture outside, unexplained, just there. Now a fountain probably meant to be Roman rather than Gothic for the rest of it. And it's in ruin. So what's down this path are people who have tried it before and signs of what's happened to them. Notice the signature, right? He signed it on the monument, TC 1837, in the middle span of those arches, as if carved directly into the rock. Again, Cole as a mason, right? Part 2, the return, right? This is the evening picture of the pair, where we see actually the exact same site from a different angle, right? So I sat at home trying to figure this out, right? Because you can't see the church there, which means the church in this one is back over here somewhere, off to the left, right? And what we see is this monument. This is the key to what we're looking at. It's the Crossroads Monument with the Virgin at the top. And she's facing now the rising sun in the morning picture, okay? In the evening picture, she's facing us. So we're out here somewhere. And she now has her back to the setting sun, which is over there, right? Off to the other side. So he shifted it around, but he's kept this in the same place, and he's moved us from standing here looking that way to sort of standing somewhere back over here and looking this way. Does that make sense now? Right? And we see the sun setting directly behind her, so rather than being lit by the sun, she's silhouetted against the sun. And can you tell what's happening here? As we look at the details, right? This is continuing the exact same story. So coming back on the return, having not heeded those warnings, the white horse is riderless. And directly in front of it are the rest of the soldiers carrying our leader dead. Right? So the warning played out. Right? So there's a nice close-up of our Madonna statue. I love the beams coming around her in the sky. And also T. Cole, right? 1837, signed on it as well. It's almost as if you could think about this as being, if it were a real place, his name is everywhere. He's like out there scribing his name on stuff everywhere you look. But again, it's signed in stone. Right? Shepherds down below, as we then move our way over and see what's happened. Our pilgrim's there again, right? And I say pilgrim because he's got a little shell on his hat, right? That's the sign of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. And again, now he's saying, kind of like I told you so, which I would say if I were carrying my dead leader, shut up, right? But there he is. He's not welcoming them back and saying, hey, this is going to happen, and what's right in front of him, but right? Symbol of time elapsing, or sundial. And a second signature by Cole, again on a rock, right? He signed this one twice on rocks. The difference here, I think, is that what Cole's saying is that some people are in harmony with nature. Some people aren't. And the idea of empire is out of sync with the laws of nature. And what's in sync is our pilgrim here with rams in the foreground, all relaxing in the landscape. But those who are out of sync are doomed to die. And we have in the background, on the right, by the monk, is a graveyard. Right? So all of these ideas of death as a metaphor for the end of the day. There's a close-up of the graveyard. You can see some of the tombs now in the background of the trees, right? And that's because our leader is dead. Everybody is sad. Their swords are down. They're mourning the passing of the leader who's being brought back on the bier to this church for burial. We see members of the church in the countryside around it. The church has the evening light glowing through the windows, and just as they come toward the church, they're about to be met with a procession with relics coming out of the church. So Cole here is very much aggrandizing landscape, right? He's turning landscape painting into something else. He's making a hybrid out of it, right? Adding narrative into landscape to underscore the meanings. And as he does that, not only does he want to elevate the status of landscape, but he also wants to use landscape as a way of adding these messages to us, to the viewers, right? Some of it is for the population as a whole, the idea of being in harmony with nature, not destroying it. The other one is for the nation and its ideology, and being careful to heed the lessons of the past when it comes to expansion, right? Imperial ideas and empire. Another commission does pretty much the same thing, right? With different images. And I've got some things to hand out to you. This is another moralizing narration landscape. Again, it's a commission. He received a commission from a man named Samuel Ward for a series of 4 pictures. In this case, he asked for something that illustrated the journey of the human soul. So unlike the Departure and Return, it wasn't a commission for a landscape picture. It was, in fact, a commission for exactly what Cole is already doing, which are these moralizing pictures using narration to add moral significance to landscape. Okay. The original commission came in 1840. Samuel Ward says, I want 4 pictures showing the voyage of the soul. So we're going to have childhood through old age in 4 stages. Okay. And he was a banker in upstate New York. When Cole was finished, he showed the works publicly, and he wanted to continue to show them to the public. But Ward said, no, I want these private. So Cole decided to paint a second set, right? And ours are the second set, right? Ours are the public pictures, but they're direct copies of the ones that he made for Ward. Might sound like you'd be mad if you were Samuel Ward, and I don't think that was exactly the case in the early 19th century. Right? So, ours are based on the commission. Ours are the secondary group that he meant to be distributed public, to be seen by everyone. And it goes back to what I was saying before about Cole, which is that he wants his pictures to have an impact on society, both on individual attitudes toward nature, but also on the nation's attitude toward this continent. And so these pictures, too, seem to have some interest in that theme of imperial expansion. And I'm using imperial sort of loosely, right? The idea of the American Empire expanding to the West Coast. Okay. So our first image, childhood, is the first of the 4, and it introduces themes that will run through all 4. In all of them, we have a boat with a traveler and a guardian angel of sorts, although I don't think that's what Cole really calls him. And the voyage of life is symbolized through that boat working its way down a river. It starts at the mountains, at the source of the river, and it ends at the ocean, where the river empties at the mouth into the ocean, right? That's the theme we will trace. And in each of the pictures, the traveler changes age. Right? I've got a handout for you. Because when this was first shown, right, when Ward's group of pictures was shown, Cole had a program for visitors that he himself had written up, right? A program, and it would explain then each of the pictures to people in great depth. This is what is depicted here, and this is what it means, right? So I'm not going to read it verbatim. I mean, you can look it over. I'll mention a couple of quotes from it as well. But he says that, let's take a look at the detail here, right? He says the boat is decorated with sculptures that represent time. He calls them the figures of the hours on the prow of the boat. He also mentions that the child is laughing, right? Innocence, carefree nature to the child itself. He talks about the stream coming out of this dark cavern on the left, right? So that's meant to be the sort of mystical source of the stream. And again, rocks, right, as the source of life, if in fact the river is the metaphor for life, life's journey, right? And he says this, it's emblematic of our earthly origin and of the mysterious past. That's the cavern, right? Our earthly origin. And again, Mason's ideas, right? We are rocks formed by God, right? He talks about the rosy light of the morning, the luxurious flowers and plants are emblems of the joyousness of early life. So the overall theme here is the carefree nature of childhood, right? He says the close banks, the tightness on either side of the river, the limited scope of the scene. He says these are meant to indicate the limited experience, the narrow experience of childhood. Right? We don't know much but what's right around us when we're kids. He also talks about the plants in the foreground. He says it's an Egyptian lotus plant in the foreground, which, by the way, the Egyptian lotus was one of the primary Mason symbols, because as Masons, stone carvers, they trace themselves back to the stone carvers who built all those wonderful Egyptian temples. Right? The Egyptian lotus in the foreground of the picture is symbolic of human life, he says. That probably comes from studying ancient Egyptian art. Right? But again, ties into Masonry, ties also into the idea of empires that have since fallen and passed away. Right? So here's the beginning of it, coming directly out of that cave into the rosy light of dawn, this happy, giddy child with his limited, closed-in experience. But you'll notice that widens as the river moves, right? So tight around the mouth of the cavern and then opening as the river flows to the right. In the second image, we look further down the river, right? So the boat continues to move. And you'll notice that our guardian angel has stepped off the boat onto the shore. The child in the first one has become a young man in image number 2. And he's looking down the river, and he looks up into the sky, and he sees this building, right? This fantastic quasi-Hindu Islamic architecture, non-Western architecture. And it's not a real building. It's just a vision of a building in the sky, right? Cole says that he intended this to show the landscape with a wider scope and more diversified in its beauty. Youth, he says, is on the verge of manhood. He is now alone in the boat and takes the helm himself. So, no longer relying on someone to look after him, someone to tend to his needs. He's taking care of it all himself. says he has an attitude, this is now Cole's word, an attitude of confidence and eager expectation. He gazes on a cloudy pile of architecture, an air-built castle. Now, if we think about the terms that he's using, this is about pipe dreams, right? Why do we call pipe dreams? Because they vaporize, right? They disappear. An air-built castle. These are his dreams for the future. And those dreams are made of nothing but hope. There's nothing solid to them. And in fact, he even goes so far as to say that the gorgeous cloud-built palace is emblematic of the daydreams of youth. Right? Manhood. Things get treacherous. We work our way downriver, right? So we started from the source. We move through the valley. As we get to manhood, we get to a place where the river starts to cascade down dramatically toward the ocean. Right? A swollen, rushing river, an impending storm, rain on the horizon. Things have become much more troublesome. This is intentioned as when we're kids, things look rosy, right? We're giddy, happy as children. As youth, we have dreams. When we're adults, it's a pain in the ass, right? It's just life is more difficult. Every year, there's more things to be worried about because you become aware of more things, right? Not to sound pessimistic, but that's the case, right? I say the difference between me and when I was 20 is I'm a lot less carefree than I used to be, right? There's always something to be worried about. The boat, he says, is there plunging amid the turbulent waters. The voyager is now a man of middle age. The helm of the boat is gone. He can't even steer the thing anymore, right? The helm is broken. The rudder is broken. And he looks imploringly toward heaven, as if heaven's aid alone could save him. So he's realized the folly of having stepped away from his guardian angel, who's still there in the clouds up above, right? And by trusting only himself, he's wound up in a dangerous situation, now must turn his eyes back to the source of his aid. And it's a frightening cascade ahead of him. Right? How do you navigate through a Class 6 rapids, right, on a boat without a rudder? He's got nothing much to hope for here. Cole says the trouble is characteristic of the period of manhood. It is only when experience has taught us the realities of the world that we lift from our eyes the golden veil of early life. In other words, only when we get used to things, how they really are, can we give up on our optimism, our unreal optimism of youth. Lower right corner, we see a typical coal-shattered tree, right? The weather and its strength has destroyed things for us. And then we see through that incredibly narrow passage the course that this river is going to take, right? And just how dangerous that's going to be. We see the guardian angel in the light, and you'll notice in the bluish clouds to the right that there are figures there as well. It talks about these demon forms hovering in the air. And he identifies them as suicide, intemperance, and murder. Right? Intemperance, drunkenness. Right? Which are the temptations that beset men in their direst troubles. So the landscape and the elements around are meant to be what is in fact troubling our man in the foreground, our man in the boat. Now, take a bit of an aside here to mention that this idea of shipwrecks, boats at sea, is in fact a time-worn symbol in landscape painting to talk about the troubles that beset mankind. For Dutch painters, and we've talked about how important Dutch painting is to American landscape painters, for Dutch painters, it was all about the troubled political times that they lived in. The ship of state, nearing danger at the rocky coast. Right? And you can even see in Backhausen's picture some of the shipwreck parts in the lower right corner. Right? But also the idea of a storm that's coming and might just pass. right? The uncertainty of the future. Cole is picking up on these traditions. Many of our landscape painters are picking up on old Dutch landscape traditions because that was the place where landscape painting really started, was in 17th century Holland. And like I said before, the political issues were very much the same. In the aftermath of a fight for independence from a foreign power, right? The country is expanding. Not in the same way, but it's still expanding. Identity, independence is tied directly to the land as a symbol and as a metaphor. Well, he makes it, right? We now imagine ourselves having gone through those rocks and out in the bay in the distance somewhere, and the guardian angel has come back, and we've made it through the rapids, made it through the rocks, and we're now at the expanse of the sea, here in old age. And of course, the metaphor of the ocean and the expanse of the ocean as a metaphor for the afterlife, for heaven itself, for the end of our journey, where the future opens up in front of us, not as an option, but as an abyss, right? As the great beyond, as we often call death. And there's our traveler. His boat's even more beat up. All of the sculptures on the front of the boat, which remember represented time, have all been broken. So time has passed, right? The helm is entirely missing. And the angel's coming back, and he's gesturing toward the clouds as they open up to him, right? That there is salvation at the end of life, right? Cole says that the rocks that we see are the last shores of the world, a few barren rocks. Angels descend, he says, down cloudy steps, as we see here in the detail, as if to welcome him to the heaven of immortal life. He's reached the ocean, he says. The world to old age is destitute of interest. He's turned his back on landscape. He's now at sea, right? No longer interested in the things around him, but now only interested in his fate and his future. Broken and drooping figures on the boat show that time is nearly ended. So again, a Christian symbol, right? Cole was pretty ardent Protestant, fairly devout. So was the patron, Samuel Ward, also very devout. That's why he commissioned a series of pictures showing the fate and the voyage of the human soul. But remember that for Cole, this is not exclusively a Christian message. That he sees these narrativized landscapes as messages for the nation. That the voyage of the human soul parallels the voyage of the nation. And that as we set forth from our cavern, as we move our way through with our dreams of empire, we must remember that eventually the route is going to get difficult. And our ship, the ship of state, could in fact be very badly damaged if we don't steer it properly. Right? For Cole, this is a very, very strong message about the fate of this young nation, in addition to being layered on top of being a message about the human soul. Right? It can't just be read as one thing. Now, Cole appeared in this picture that we talked about when we talked about the difficult reading by Wolfe, where we see Thomas Cole standing on the edge in very Thomas Cole fashion, right on the edge of a precipice, along with William Cullen Bryant. There they are, pointing. Cole has his magnifying glass, his monoscope, and his sketchbook, looking over his shoulder to Bryant. This was painted the year after Cole died as an homage to him. And as we look at works by Asher Durand, one of the things we'll see is that this is Asher Durand trying to be Thomas Cole. That the majority of Asher Durand images don't emulate Thomas Cole's drama as much as this one does. because this was meant as an epitaph, right? A remembrance of Thomas Cole, who died quite young, right? Died in his 40s. So Cole on the right, William Cullen Bryant on the left in this picture. Now, Bryant was famous as a poet, and his single most famous poem, I have a handout for you, was written actually when he was 16 years old. Which is pretty incredible. Right, so the name of the poem, did everybody get one? I don't think it's made it all the way to the back yet. Did you get one? Yeah. Okay, great. Right, this poem was written when he was 16, called, sorry about that, Thanatopsis, which means the death of sight. And it's a typical romantic poem meditating on death. But it uses landscape as a metaphor for life. And that's an important thing to remember, is how important that theme was, that landscape can be a metaphor for life. So it has, the lines are numbered, right? So we can pop around in the poem and look at particular sections of it. I want to look at right around line 10, actually line 8, when thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony and shroud and pall, and breathless darkness, and the narrow house makes you shudder and grow sick at heart. Right? Go forth under the open sky and listen to nature's teachings. Okay, so when things go bad, go take a hike, right? Go out and listen to nature, right? I'm being recorded, but when the shit hits the fan, go walk around. We're lucky right here. I used to take hikes right the path that's over here on 26. There are deer down there. There's 2 or 3 families of deer that live right down there. It's really kind of wonderful. If you get there in the morning, right, you can go see some 2 or 3 point elk and their babies, right, bouncing around. And all of a sudden, it doesn't matter anymore. It's okay. Everything's okay, right? It's like, how Marymount brings the puppies here on the first Wednesday of every month, right? There's something about communing with nature that just makes you realize that the problems aren't as bad as you think they might be, right? So, right, when thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight, go forth under the open sky and listen to nature's teachings, right? While from all around earth and her waters and the depths of the air comes a still voice, right? And Durand is trying to capture that element, right, of going out. Why do you go into nature? What's the point of landscape painting? It's to learn something about life, right? To meditate on a particular level. And certainly Cole was doing this as well, thinking about meaning within the landscape. And so is Bryant. And this is why he sees them as kindred spirits, right? They are both, from their different art, looking to nature for solace, for something greater than ourselves. Jump ahead to line 25. Surrendering up thine individual being shalt thou go, to mix forever with the elements, to be a brother to the sensible rock. I don't know if he was a Mason too, but it sure sounds like it, doesn't it? Brother to the sensible rock. We are all rocks being carved by God. And if we see how God carved the rocks in nature, we can certainly begin to think about him working on us, right? I love how in the picture it looks as if Cole is pointing at the rocks across the valley, right? If you follow the direction of that periscope, right, it's pointing directly across the way. Look at Brother Rock, right, and understand better yourself. Right? So Bryant's poem is in a spirit with Cole. And both of them are very much interested in looking to nature to understand ourselves better, right? And using nature not just as an observation of natural phenomenon, but as a moral lesson for ourselves, for our nation. And if we go back to what we were talking about on Friday, about the art union, for example, right? And the National Academy of Design talking about how important art was and how important artists were as the people that could carry the moral weight of the nation, right? Establish the moral direction through their art. And I get wrapped up in this because I think that we forget how much in the history of art artists expected themselves to be socially engaged, deeply engaged with the fate of the country, and the ability of their art to actually affect positive change in the world. It's not how we tend to think about art anymore. Not always. We do, but we call it protest art. But in fact, Thomas Cole, Asher Durand, these are not protest art, but they are art that firmly believes that it can make a difference. A positive difference. You can make negative differences too, right? And I think that's important for us to all take away from this, not just the artists in the room, but everybody, to realize that what we do, what you choose to do with your life, whatever career, you can make a difference. You can make a positive difference. You can still make a living doing it, right? But it doesn't have to be just that. We have some responsibility to this community we belong to. And that responsibility is to make it a better place than when we got there. Right? And Bryant feels that, Durand feels that, Cole feels that. Now, most of Durand's works are nowhere near as dramatic as this. In fact, the vast majority of paintings by Asher Durand have rather sedate, mellow, non-dramatic scenes. So if we compare, for example, this picture, Dutchess County, New York, we see people there climbing up on top of rocks again, right? And we see them getting up high so they can have a view out over this wonderful vista of low-lying plains. But you'll also notice that it's not as if they take a step too far and they're going to die. It's not Thomas Cole on top of Mount Holyoke, right? It's not Cole and Durand in Kindred Spirits, right? It's not the edge of the world. It's not waiting for an avalanche. They're on slightly high rock, but if we read the landscape, it cascades down underneath those rocks, down to the cows, and then it bends and goes down gradually to the land below them. It doesn't have the drama. It doesn't have the danger that Thomas Cole does. This only adds to the fact that Kindred Spirits is an atypical Asher Durand. And that atypicality comes from the fact that he's trying to channel Thomas Cole, who's just passed away, right? Makes his most Thomas Cole-like painting. So they're gentler, right? The landscape is more gentle. I think that's a nice way of putting it, right? More sedate. And the transitions less sharp and distinct, but rather more mediated and gradual. So our three people out for a wonderful view. There are surrogates again, looking out to the landscape, seeing what there is to see out there. Again, a sort of lushness to it with wonderful dramatic rocks, but not, again, like a Thomas Cole. No metaphors for our destruction of the land. In fact, it looks as if, as she's looking out, we see cultivated fields. but there doesn't seem to be any judgment against those like Crawford Notch by Cole, where clear cutting was put forth as perhaps a sign that we're out of harmony with nature. Instead, we look out and we see peaceful coexistence. Man controlling nature with the field that's been tended, the figures tending the field, that's what we're looking at. But there's no overt symbolism that this is a bad thing. In fact, it's fairly laid back, right? Cows, figures strolling on a path, sheep, become our surrogates for moving through the landscape. And it's gentle, and it's slow, and it's relaxed, and it's peaceful. This is man in harmony with nature. This idea of cows as a metaphor for this is, again, it comes out of, I think, they're looking at Dutch landscaping. Every time I go through American landscape, even American art in general in the 19th century, I can't stop thinking about the Dutch. Because this use of the cows to establish a mood and a theme of bucolic relaxation. Right? Halcyon days where, don't you wish you had a day where you could just go sit on the bluff while your cows relax? Instead of thinking, I gotta go home and work after dinner tonight, get some grading done or whatever, homework for you, grading for me, right? The cows become a surrogate for this establishment of the mood. And Durand, he's not copying this picture at all, but I think he's very much aware of this tradition of shepherd pictures as an antidote to the crazy busyness of city life. And the people who were buying these pictures, right, from Asher Durand, the same kind of people that were buying these pictures from Albert Calp. And those are people who lived in cities, surrounded by hubbub every day, and using pictures as a mode of escape, visual relaxation. And that's exactly what Durand provides for us, is a meditation point where we can enter into a world that is unlike our day-to-day life, without having to get in the carriage and go off to the countryside. Armchair tourism. So each of these are presented to an urban audience to give them a way of getting out of that. And both of them present to us a landscape that is unspoiled, where the progress of civilization hasn't really altered it drastically. Where if we've come into this landscape, we've come into it in harmony with what's going on. Part of this suggests that he's maybe tapping into an idea within landscape that really goes back to ancient Greece, the idea of Arcadia. Arcadia in Greek mythology was an island, a region, populated by shepherds, where time had stood still, literally, where there was no death, where you could live forever in perfect harmony with nature. And the painting on the left in Paris, in Arcadia Ego, are some shepherds from Arcadia figuring out that even in Arcadia, there are signs of death. They're looking at the tomb, right? That's inscribed, even in Arcadia, I exist. I am. But these are Arcadian pictures, meant to suggest that this rural landscape, this quiet, gentle landscape, is itself this unspoiled perfection, where everything is in harmony forever and ever. So it's quite a different picture from what we saw with Cole. Pastoral as a term relates to the idea of Arcadia. Pastoral just means shepherds, right? A shepherd-based landscape. And so here in the NGA, another of these quiet, gentle landscapes without dramatic changes in topography. The light at the end of the day adding to the sense of quietude, of relaxation, time not elapsing, right? Of where you don't look at your watch. You leave your watch behind because it doesn't matter, right? You'll be more in harmony with the rhythms of the day. So in this case here at the end of the day, we see very little in the way of human activity. We see only these cows basking in the sun. And then the landscape gently going down to a quiet river, gently lapping through, maybe it's even a lake, lapping through the landscape. And as we move our way back, almost nothing in the way of human activity. Unspoiled nature. And not for its drama, although we see that elsewhere in American pictures, right? For Durand, it's the unspecial views that are just as special. One more Durand and then we'll quit. Or before we get there, right? Again, legacies, right? These American painters are very much aware of artistic legacies. And they're looking often back to the great period of landscape painting, which is from the 17th century. We talked a lot about the Dutch, but there are French painters as well that dealt with these bucolic, Arcadian, pastoral landscapes. And Claude Lorrain, this is in Philadelphia. We don't have a good pastoral one by Claude here. He's working in Italy, does these scenes of the end of the day. After the work is done, some relaxation of peasants sitting around drinking, actually, and chilling, and their cows pretty much doing the same. With, again, the dappled light of early evening coming through the trees. Durand, very much the same. Right? Less horizontal with this light, but still the idea that we are approaching the end of the day. Another pastoral landscape from Durand in the National Gallery, it's pastoral scene, pastoral landscape. And here it gets a little bit more complicated. It's similar in so many ways. I mean, you can almost tell that these are kind of trafficking in the same symbols, just rearranged ever so slightly. Right? We have a dirt path going past broken branches leading down to water, cows on that hill working their way down, water leading through. Whether or not these are real vistas is up to some interpretation, but you'll notice that there's a certain, what do I want to say, a certain similarity to the structure of the landscape, as if he's not observing, but rather making it up. And with this one, we actually do see humans coming in on the far shore. So there's our cows working our way down. Again, suggesting this theme of simple life, easy life, escape from the city. On the far shore, we start to see the encroachments of man, boat at a harbor, a small house nestled in the hills, in the trees, and some question as to whether or not this is intended to be positive or negative. And he's not 100% sure or clear about that. We have a church further downriver. We have figures crossing a bridge, a stone bridge, as the river runs underneath it. Is this man taming nature, or is it man coexisting with nature? Or is it neither of the above, and simply the idea of crossing a bridge as a metaphor for life's journey, right? Transition to the other side. Bridges were used throughout the history of landscape painting as metaphors for transition, moving from one state to another. Finally, I was looking at this to see if there were any people back there. I only noticed at the very end that there's a tiny little house nestled through this other path that we assume might be part of the path that leads to that road. But again, there's so little in the way of human activity, except for crossing that bridge, taking that boat from one shore to the other. That suggests to me that the whole idea of the human activity is for us as viewers to associate the landscape with life, with our journey, which is again something that Cole did, and Durand loved Thomas Cole. But he's approaching this idea in a very, very different way. Okay, so on Friday, let's see. Friday we're going to look at some more landscapes. We're going to kind of wrap that section up. And then we've got your review, your revised version due on Friday of your first response paper. So be sure with that you look at my comments on the thing I emailed back to you, plus any notes you might have taken during our class session. You can use both of those to revise, right? And next Monday, we'll go through a bibliography exercise. So this weekend, I know it's early to talk about the weekend, shows where my mind is. This weekend, what you ought to be doing is trying to make some serious headway on your bibliography so you can come in with any real questions you might have. So that next Monday, or next Tuesday, we can actually talk about it rather than in the abstract. Okay? So try to make as much headway on that as you can this weekend. All right? I'll see you guys on Friday.